What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and while we are covering Invincible on Patreon, I hit people up on Patreon and said, hey, do you guys care if we cover this on the main channel? And there were a couple people who were kind of like, I kind of like it being on Patreon, but most people were like, no, it'd be kind of cool if you did that, right? Because they want to see what other people's reactions are like. So we're going to test this. I'm going to throw up Invincible Volume 2, right? Technically, Season 1 of the Invincible show more or less ends with like issue 26 of the comic book series. If you guys are going out and buying it and you guys are reading it, Season 1 ends with issue 26. I mean, there's maybe a couple other issues after that, or like some little tidbits from future issues, 27, 28, different things like that. But we're just going to test this, right? And I'm curious to see how people are going to respond to this. If people are going to care or if they're not going to care. All right, what's going on, guys? This is Rob, and I'm a little late to the party here, but it's been a super busy day today. But we are picking up with more of Invincible right now. This part that we pick up with here is a part that already aired with regards to the TV show. But we basically end up kind of joining with Mark when he gets a call from his dad, right? When Nolan calls him up and says, hey man, I got to go do a thing with the Guardians of the Globe, but there's going to be an alien showing up here. He's a pretty bad guy. Make sure you deal with him. And so Mark ultimately ends up taking off into space. Now, the funny thing is this is the first time we learn that Nolan can actually hold his breath for like 2 weeks. Mark can hold his breath for like an hour or something along those lines. Once Mark gets to space, then suddenly he's met by the arrival of Alan the alien. Now, here's the cool thing. Alan the alien is probably one of the most important characters of Invincible. But initially you don't get that. Instead, he's just kind of here, and there's a bit of a fight that breaks out between the two of them. Now, Alan also uses telepathy, which is how he and Mark are able to communicate with each other. And for the most part, Alan demonstrates a pretty good amount of proficiency in fighting, right? In hand-to-hand combat. Certainly more so than Mark, because Mark's still pretty much brand new to the whole thing. But ultimately, Mark takes him into the moon, right? Just like crashes him into the moon. And then they kind of start talking things out. And that's when Alan reveals that he's part of a group called the Coalition of Planets, right? And the whole idea behind this is basically when these individuals are sent off into space for the purpose of like safeguarding planets, that the Coalition sends what is basically somebody like Alan to kind of test them, to see how capable they are in terms of protecting various worlds. So he's what's called a champion evaluation officer. Now, the funny thing about this is that he is actually at the wrong planet. that in essence, he basically says that he's here to visit a planet called Urath, and in reality, he's actually at Earth. Now, the crazy thing is he's kind of like, okay, definitely the wrong world. And then they kind of go through like these 50-year rotations, more or less, and that he's up for like a new rotation or really an evaluation in like 20 years, and he's been basically coming to the wrong world for the last 15 years, right? So it's kind of nuts. He's basically been doing terrible at his job, and then ultimately kind of takes off, right? Once he realizes that he's basically in the wrong place, and he and Mark more or less, I wouldn't say become friends, but they have kind of a familiar relationship, right? Where it's kind of like, okay, cool, you're a cool guy, well, you're a cool guy too, awesome, let's kind of call it a day. From there, when Mark gets back, he kind of tells his dad about, everything that had gone on, and the fact that this guy, Alan the alien, had been showing up to the wrong planet for the last 15 years, and initially Nolan kind of takes it in a funny way, and then he's like, okay, well, I'm pretty impressed you were able to handle it that way, that kind of a thing. And so, of course, Mark has homework and stuff to take care of, but from there, things actually get particularly interesting here. And the reason why is because William, of course, as most of you guys know, a friend of Mark, is coming to see Mark the next day because they're actually going to Upstate University to kind of check out, the college campus, right, where he's going to be going to school at. And so the funny thing is that while they're doing that, basically Nolan and his wife are kind of like, all right, I mean, time to touch naughty bits, right? It's just, it's time to do the damn thing because the kid's gone. While that's going on, Robot basically calls together the remainder, or really the other members of Team and kind of says, look, I've been, kind of moved up to the Guardians of the Globe, right? I've been like, promoted to their ranks, but I'm also disbanding this team because I cannot efficiently be a part of both, right? And so it's really kind of a last goodbye to Robot where they're kind of like, cool, go on ahead and do your thing and sort of call it a day. And then you also have a guy by the name of Sanford. Now, Sanford is a guy who had powers at one point in time, and by whatever manner and whatever means, which we won't reveal here, basically lost them. And the result was that he was essentially kicked off the Guardians team, right? Because he didn't have any powers. They didn't really have any use for him. And he's basically waiting on like a replacement suit, right, from the tailor, a guy who can kind of give him a new suit that'll essentially give him his powers back, or at least some measure of powers, and he can regain his rightful place on the Guardians, right? So that's where it's kind of given to us that Robot is essentially taking the place of Sanford on the team. It's more or less what's happening. And it's going to be 2 days until it happens, which is really more than just Sanford seems to be able to wait. Now, at this point, he seems to have been out of the team for a little while. So what's 2 days, right, in comparison to all that? And so kind of jumping on with Mark and William kind of pisses a few people off just because of the fact that, because his name's William, Bill is a shorthand name for that. And a few people are like, hey man, like, do you prefer Bill? And that's one of those social etiquette things where it's a person saying like, can I call you Bill? But not really saying that. And it's like, it's actually William, right? And it just seems to kind of rub people the wrong way. I don't know why. This is why I don't really care about social norms, right? They're really more annoying than anything else. It's not that I don't understand them. It's just that I find social norms to be a nuisance. So more often than not, I usually just ignore them and just kind of do my own thing. It does kind of rub people the wrong way, but at the end of the day, I don't really care. They'll be fine. They'll get over it. And it's one of the kind of discussions that goes on. And even William kind of puts that idea forward. Like, man, here's the thing. He's like, it's kind of irritating. He's like, if I tell them, sure, you can call me Bill, then they don't call me by the name that I prefer. But if I say I prefer William, then they see me as kind of like rude or snooty because I'm William instead of Bill, So he's like, it's lose-lose. And I'm like, you know what, William? Who cares, man? It doesn't really matter all that much. And they kind of run into this issue a couple of different times. But then something amazing happens, right? It's one of the funniest things ever. So you basically end up having this really like a villain, more or less, that seemingly shows up out of nowhere and then goes to attack Mark while he's with William, right? And the reality is he's actually heading in a direction. It's just everybody else there is more or less collateral damage. But Mark's like, oh my God, oh man, like what was that? And he's like, William, get out of the way. And then Mark takes off, changes into his costume, comes back, and then basically destroys the robot. And then just kind of like disappears and returns as Mark. And he's like, William, man, are you okay? I can't believe that happened. And William's like, dude, why didn't you tell me you had superpowers? Right off the bat, William figures out that Mark is invincible, right? And honestly, it kind of makes sense. And I love that Robert Kirkman did this because only an idiot would fall for like the Superman thing, where like somebody's attacking the city and Clark's like, oh man, I forgot something in the office, and then he goes and, changes into a Superman costume or like takes off his shirt and Superman underneath, and then he defeats the villain, and then he comes back and nobody's any the wiser. Like, man, Clark, you missed the whole thing, It's things like that never made any sense to me. It's one of the things we always kind of poke at, and it's kind of funny, right, when you're reading it, but nonetheless, it's a little weird there. Of course, we also get a little bit of a visit between Mark and Nolan showing up to meet the tailor, only for the tailor to basically reveal that he had been in the process of developing a suit for Sanford that would basically give him his powers back, but the suit has essentially been stolen. Now, the implication as it's given here by the tailor is that it looks like a Sanford. He doesn't say that it is. He's just kind of like, man, it's a little weird, right? Like, this guy was supposed to get his powers back in a couple days. He indicated he couldn't wait. Suddenly the suit goes missing, right? Like, he's the only person that really knew that I was working on the suit for him, that kind of a thing. And so that's it kind of points to, and kind of really points to the idea that he was the reason why it happened, right? The Sanford was the reason why this all kind of went down. And so from there, what we end up doing here is basically picking up with something pretty interesting, but it's really something that you've already seen before. You do get kind of like the who are the Guardians of the Globe. The reality is the Guardians of the Globe are basically the Justice League. So there's really not anything here of any significance that you didn't probably catch in the TV show, but basically the Guardians have all kind of been called together, and then they're all basically killed by Nolan. Now, something that I do want to point out here is the quickness in which they died here was much faster than it was in the show. In the show, the Guardians put up a fight. In the comic, it happened like within the span of seconds, right? And that was really designed, I imagine, by Kirkman to really show us just how powerful Nolan is, and in relation to everybody else, that like none of them really have a chance on him. He's just that damn powerful. But it's also kind of this revelation that Nolan's a bad guy, right? Like, Nolan killed the entire Guardians of the Globe. And so it's kind of like, okay, like, now here's the crazy thing. As nuts as this revelation is, it only gets crazier, right? Like, the story of Nolan only gets more and more insane. But it's one of these things where, like, as soon as this dropped, I remember reading this, as soon as this dropped, it was mind-blowing. It was like, holy cow. Now, of course, following that, Nolan, of course, doesn't tell anybody he killed the Guardians of the Globe, and he kind of lets everybody go on the operation that, like, man, the Guardians have been taken out by somebody, and it's kind of nuts. He sort of plays into it, and he's like, I'm still kind of in shock, by knowing that happened. That's absolutely bonkers, And again, it's a little bit of detective work going on, trying to figure out how the Guardians die, but one of the things that I want you guys to notice here is nobody suspects Nolan, right? And that's something that we're going to find later on, but you end up picking up with Mark when he gets back home and finds Eve in his bedroom. And I mean, she's crying, right? So obviously the circumstances could be much, much better. And that's when you basically end up finding out that Rex had cheated on Eve, right? Now, I'm going to be honest with you guys, Rex is a little bit of an idiot for cheating on Eve, but at the same time, he's kind of not, because Kate can duplicate herself. So like, you could have a threesome like anytime you want. And it's kind of like, I mean, okay, Rex, I kind of understand where you're coming from. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, you don't sanction it. Like, you're not like, oh yeah, good job, Rex, you cheated on your girl. You don't really sanction it. The real question you have to ask here is that if Kate duplicates herself and then she gets into a threesome with somebody else, is it considered incest? That's a real question you have to ask, right? I mean, this really took a dark turn. That's why these videos don't go on the regular YouTube channel, guys. But nonetheless, right, as soon as Mark's mom shows up in the bedroom and realizes Eve's there, Eve's like, is basically laying her head in Mark's lap. So like, from behind, it looks like the worst case scenario, right? It looks like Mark's getting some dome. And so she calls him downstairs stairs and really kind of starts reading the riot act. And it's like, look, you don't understand, right? Like, we're not banging. Like, we're not touching naughty boots. But at the end of the day, like, you know, it's just one of these things where I'm kind of helping her get through a situation, right? That kind of a thing. Now, of course, Nolan also reveals the Guardians of the Globe are dead, which is kind of a crazy thing. And that's what's also sort of nuts, is that it's really Eve in a lot of ways kind of figuring out that like Mark is the son of Omni-Man, right? Which is a pretty big deal, right? That's a huge thing to go down. But ultimately, you kind of have Mark and Nolan who are going to the funeral for the Guardians. And again, like one of the things that you notice here, you actually don't see it in the TV show. You've got Savage Dragon. This is one of those few instances when characters from Image Comics will cross over with each other. Doesn't happen very often, but you do get Savage Dragon, which is kind of cool. But again, this is one of those instances where like Nolan gets up there and starts making a speech. And then you have the Mahler Twins who show up. Now the Mahler Twins again are like these evil geniuses. One of them's a clone, the other's the original. And for the most part, they're always usually up to some nefarious purposes. But it's one of these things where they kind of seem to show up here for like literally offering their genuine respects to a great team, right? To a powerful team. And so ultimately, no one here suspects Nolan. Like no one here looks at Nolan and is like, dude, I bet Nolan did it, right? I bet Nolan was the guy who killed the Guardians of the Globe. Nobody says that, right? Because Nolan is considered such a prodigious character. The sort of ambiance he puts off, right? The kind of personality he puts off is beyond reproach. He's so respected. Nobody thinks it would be him, right? So it's like the perfect guys. And so ultimately, like the whole funeral's like literally interrupted. Like somebody literally hits a funeral, right? It's nuts. Like they hit a funeral and it turns out to be like the butler to Sanford, right? That's the crazy thing, is like the butler kind of went nuts and was pissed off because of what happened to Sanford, right? And so when that whole thing goes down, like literally everybody moves, right? Everybody starts getting into action, going after the butler, which for the most part, they're able to kind of take this guy out, right? Like Omni-Man just takes him out with a swiftness, and that's essentially it. And then from there, it's kind of like, okay, like the whole crowd kind of disperses, and that's it, right? There's not a whole lot going on there. And so from there, you get a couple things that happen. One of them is pretty cool, right? Like William shows up to Mark's house and is like, hey man, look, so I know you have powers, and I know this seems kind of weird, but like, can you fly me into the sky? And so Mark flies his friend around for a little while, which is pretty awesome. And then the kind of conclusion here, right? The kind of finale is, again, like you end up having one of these guys who is basically, you know, kind of converted into a bomb by David Hiles, right? You guys remember him from the last story that we did, where he was essentially a villain, right? He was a guy who was turning kids into bombs and then detonating them. One of these kids, of course, survived the whole experience, but the bomb stays attached to him, right? I mean, it's more or less neutralized, but like he has to have those components as part of his body in order to survive. And he literally starts to take, like he just unzips his pants and just pisses on the guy's grave. But then you have a couple kids who also show up here to basically, you know, dig up or to really kind of really dig up the graves of these guys. And part of this is just nonsense, right? Like supposedly, if you drink from the immortal skull, you'll live forever, right? Immortal being one of the members of the Guardians of the Globe. It's kind of nuts. Like, you know, they read about it on the internet. It's a complete dick move, right? To like go to the grave of superheroes and like dig their graves up. But as they kind of get further down and as they ultimately hit to where the graves are, suddenly they're met with the arrival of the Mahler Twins. So again, these guys are definitely up to no good. What it is that they're up to, well, we'll have to wait and find out for the next video. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Thank you guys for being patrons. I love you guys to death, and I will catch you all later. Peace.